The wind moaned through the blackened pines of Pike County that night in 1834, carrying with it the cry of something not quite human. Rain fell in sheets against the roof of a sagging cabin where a woman labored alone except for a trembling midwife who had seen enough births to know this one wasn't natural. The thunder cracked like the earth itself splitting open, and with the next flash of lightning, 2 infants entered the world, one slick with blood and breathing shallowly, the other silent but wide-eyed, staring straight into the shadows as if they'd been waiting for him. The mother's scream was swallowed by the storm. By dawn, she was dead, her face twisted in terror no one could name. The twins grew under a sky that seemed to darken wherever they went. When one laughed, the other winced. When one fell ill, the other coughed blood. There were nights when neighbors swore they saw 2 silhouettes in the field though the boys were locked inside. And as the years crawled on, Pike County began to whisper about the Ashworth Twins, the cursed children who shared not just a birth, but something far deeper. Something ancient. Something that even the grave might not divide. The storm that swept across Pike County in the spring of 1834 was said to be the worst in 50 years. It began with distant rumbling that shook the valley floor and ended with lightning so fierce that it turned night into day for fleeting seconds. In a dilapidated cabin perched on the edge of the woods, Mary Ashworth clutched her swollen belly as thunder rattled the glass in its frames. Her husband had gone to fetch the midwife hours earlier, but neither of them returned before the rain came down in sheets. By the time the old midwife stumbled through the door, drenched and trembling, the air inside was thick with the metallic scent of blood and fear. Mary's cries were not the cries of an ordinary woman in labor, they were sharp, primal, as though something ancient and unwilling was being forced into this world. The first child came just after midnight, pale and frail, but alive. The midwife wiped the boy's face, waiting for his twin. Moments later, a second infant slid into her trembling hands, yet the silence that followed was deafening. He did not cry. He did not struggle. His eyes, an unnatural shade of grey-blue, were wide open, fixed on the shadows that danced across the cabin walls. Even the midwife, hardened by years of difficult births, froze under his gaze. When the first flash of lightning cut through the room, the midwife thought she saw movement in the corner, something hunched, something watching. But when she turned, there was nothing. The silence pressed on, heavy and suffocating. The second child blinked once, slow and deliberate, as though already aware of his surroundings. Mary's breathing grew shallow, her face ashen. She whispered something the midwife could not understand, a word that sounded more like a plea than speech. Then her body went rigid. The candlelight flickered, and a wind seemed to rush through the sealed cabin. When it died down, Mary Ashworth lay still, her mouth open in a frozen scream that would not fade from the midwife's memory for the rest of her life. The midwife wrapped the infants in cloth and placed them side by side in the cradle, though she could not bear to look at the silent one for long. As dawn broke, the storm gave way to a heavy mist that blanketed the woods, muffling the world in eerie stillness. The neighbors arrived hours later to find the cabin cold, the mother dead, and 2 newborns lying together, one sleeping peacefully, the other staring blankly toward the door as if waiting for someone, or something, that had not yet arrived. By morning, the storm had thinned into a cold drizzle, leaving the Ashworth cabin wrapped in a silence too heavy for dawn. The midwife sat slumped in a chair by the hearth, her hands still trembling, her eyes fixed on the 2 infants lying beside their mother's lifeless body. Mary Ashworth's face had twisted into an expression that defied peace, her eyes wide open, mouth contorted as if caught in an eternal scream. The midwife had seen death before, but never like this. There was no sign of struggle, no wound, no illness she could name. It was as though something unseen had reached inside her and taken what it wanted, leaving behind a body that was merely an echo of the terror that had passed through it. The husband, Elijah Ashworth, arrived soon after, covered in mud and rain, calling his wife's name before he even crossed the threshold. When he entered and saw her, he collapsed to his knees, his cries echoing through the small cabin and spilling into the wet morning air. The midwife could offer no comfort. Her voice cracked as she tried to explain that the birth had gone wrong, though even she knew that wasn't the truth. There had been no blood loss, no fever, no reason for a healthy woman to die moments after her second child took his first breath. Elijah clutched the twins, his tears falling onto their tiny faces, but when his gaze met that of the silent baby, the one whose eyes were still open, watching, he froze. A shudder passed through him, though he could not have said why. In the days that followed, the midwife refused to return to the cabin. She told the neighbors that the place felt cursed, that something unnatural lingered there. Rumors began to coil through the town like smoke, stories of a spirit that had come for Mary during the storm, or that one of the twins had stolen her breath in order to live. The preacher called for a blessing of the house, but even he hesitated when he stood before it. The air was still wrong there, thick and unmoving, as though the storm had never really left. When they buried Mary Ashworth behind the cabin, the wind picked up again, rattling the trees though the sky was clear. The newborns were carried back inside, their father broken but silent. That night, as he sat by the fire holding both boys, one began to cry softly, a thin, human sound that trembled in the quiet. The other did not. He only stared at the flames, his reflection dancing in his wide grey eyes, and for a fleeting moment, Elijah thought he saw something move behind that gaze, something old, watching him from within. As the twins grew, the strangeness surrounding them deepened until it became the unspoken shadow that followed the Ashworth name. By the time they were 5, it was clear that what happened to one was mirrored by the other in ways that defied all sense and reason. If one scraped his knee while playing near the creek, the other would flinch and lift his pant leg to reveal the same cut, fresh and bleeding though he had never left the house. If one fell asleep, the other's eyes would grow heavy as though pulled by an invisible thread. The connection was not simply emotional, it was physical, almost spiritual, and the people of Pike County, steeped in superstition, began to whisper that it was the work of something unholy. Elijah Ashworth tried to protect his sons from the talk, but the rumors spread faster than he could silence them. The local preacher called the boys unnatural mirrors, and mothers began to pull their children away when the twins walked through town. The silent one, the second-born, frightened them most. He rarely spoke and never played. He would sit by the window for hours, watching the tree line, as if waiting for someone to emerge from the woods. The other twin, lively and gentle, tried to coax him into laughter, but even his attempts seemed to drain the air of warmth. It was said that when one twin smiled, the other's eyes grew darker, like a reflection of joy tainted by sorrow. One summer afternoon, Elijah called the town doctor after finding both boys screaming in pain. When he examined them, he found identical bruises on their ribs, shaped like hands, deep and purple, as though someone had gripped them with monstrous force. But there was no intruder, no struggle, no explanation. The doctor left pale and shaken, muttering that he would not come back. Word of the incident spread quickly, and by the next week, the family's name was being whispered in the church pews. Some said the twins had been born under the devil's storm, others that their mother's spirit lingered inside them, bound between two bodies. Elijah began keeping them inside after dark, locking the doors, burning candles through the night as if light itself could protect them. Yet strange things still happened. Neighbors claimed they saw figures moving behind the curtains long after the candles burned out. And on nights when the wind carried the echo of the old storm, the twins could be heard talking in low voices that matched perfectly in tone and rhythm, as if they were speaking to each other or through each other from two sides of the same soul. When the twins turned 10, the Ashworth household began to experience disturbances that unsettled even the most skeptical neighbors. It started with faint tapping behind the walls, as if small hands were knocking from the other side. Dishes would rattle in their cabinets without cause, and Elijah often woke in the night to find one or both boys standing in the hallway, staring at the mirror that hung across from their mother's old rocking chair. The silent twin, who rarely spoke or showed emotion, seemed especially drawn to the mirror. He would stand before it for long stretches, eyes locked on his reflection, whispering things no one could quite make out. His brother would sometimes join him, and their mirrored movements were so precise it was impossible to tell who began and who followed. One evening, during a sudden storm reminiscent of the night they were born, the mirror shattered on its own. The sound was deafening, like a gunshot that cracked through the house. Elijah rushed in to find shards scattered across the floor, and only one child, the silent twin, standing before the empty frame. His brother was gone. The windows were locked, the doors bolted, and there were no footprints leading outside. The search began immediately, with men from town scouring the woods and the creek, calling the missing boy's name until dawn. For 3 days there was nothing, no trace, no sound, only the eerie quiet that hung over the cabin like a curse. On the morning of the fourth day, Elijah awoke to find his missing son sitting by the fireplace, barefoot, his clothes damp as if he'd crawled out of the river. When asked where he had been, the boy only smiled faintly and said, "I was on the other side." His voice was strange, lower, almost unfamiliar, and his eyes no longer matched his twins. They were darker, clouded, as if something had seeped into him during his absence. The midwife, now an old woman living in seclusion, was called to see him. She refused to cross the threshold, saying the boy carried the storm in his shadow. After that night, the twins were never quite the same. The once lively brother grew withdrawn, his laughter replaced by a quiet fear he could not explain. The silent one spoke more often now, his tone measured and knowing, sometimes addressing Elijah by name instead of father. At times, he would stand before the shattered mirror's empty frame, tracing its outline with his fingers and whispering, "It's still open," as though the glass had not broken but rather revealed a door that was never meant to be seen. Not long after the strange disappearance and return of one of the twins, word of the Ashworth family's misfortunes spread beyond Pike County. Stories of unnatural happenings in their home reached a traveling minister, Reverend Silas Moore, who claimed to have confronted darkness made flesh in other corners of Kentucky. Elijah, desperate to bring peace to his sons and rid the house of the heavy air that clung to it, invited the minister to stay and perform a blessing. The Reverend arrived one gray afternoon, a tall, gaunt man whose coat smelled faintly of salt and smoke. He spoke with confidence, assuring Elijah that no evil could stand before the light of his faith. Yet the moment he crossed the threshold, his expression faltered. The air inside the cabin was colder than the wind outside, and the walls seemed to pulse faintly, as if breathing in rhythm with the boy's quiet movements. The twins watched the minister with an unnerving stillness. The silent one stood nearest to the old rocking chair, his gaze locked on the minister's cross. When Reverend Moore began his prayer, the candles flickered violently though there was no draught. The floorboards creaked beneath him as if something shifted underneath, slow and deliberate. The Reverend's voice wavered, but he pressed on, his words growing louder, commanding whatever spirit lingered there to reveal itself. The fire in the hearth flared, a blinding white for an instant, and then died completely, plunging the room into darkness. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the twins breathing, one steady, one ragged. Then, in that stillness, Reverend Moore dropped to his knees, clutching his head and muttering words that made no sense. Elijah tried to help him, but the man screamed, his voice hoarse and cracking, shouting about eyes beneath the soil and a heart that beats in twain. The twins stood frozen, though the silent one tilted his head as if listening to something only he could hear. The Reverend's body convulsed once, and then he collapsed. When he finally opened his eyes again, something was gone from them. Whatever he had seen in that moment had broken him beyond repair. He stayed in Pike County for 3 more days, wandering the woods aimlessly, speaking to the ground as though expecting an answer. When he finally left, his hair had turned nearly white. He never preached again. Those who saw him last said he warned travelers to stay clear of the Ashworth land, claiming that what lived beneath that cabin was not a ghost but something far older, something that watched from below, waiting for the rest of its soul to return. After the minister's collapse, an uneasy quiet settled over the Ashworth property. For weeks, nothing unusual happened, and Elijah began to hope that whatever darkness had taken root there had finally passed. But the calm did not last. One morning, the neighbors awoke to find a dozen of their livestock dead, cows, goats, even a few dogs strewn across the pastures without a single wound. Their bodies were pale, their veins collapsed, their blood completely gone as if drained by something that left no mark. The town doctor was summoned again, and though he searched for a rational cause, none could be found. It was as if life itself had been pulled from them, leaving only husks behind. Fear spread quickly through Pike County, and soon the whispers began again, all leading back to the Ashworth twins. The first accusations came from a farmer whose animals grazed near the woods behind the Ashworth cabin. He swore he'd seen 2 figures moving through the fog the night before the deaths, their outlines identical, gliding rather than walking. Others claimed that the silent twin had been seen near the creek at dusk, kneeling in the water and murmuring to his reflection. By the time the town gathered for Sunday service, The preacher spoke openly of the unclean and called on Elijah to bring his sons forth for prayer. Elijah refused, locking the doors and refusing entry to anyone who came near his land. Inside the cabin, he found the boys sitting by the hearth, their faces pale, their eyes distant. When he asked what they knew of the animals, neither spoke, but the lively one began to cry softly while his brother stared at him in silence, a faint smile curling at the corner of his mouth. That night, Elijah woke to a sound outside, something dragging across the porch. When he opened the door, he found a dead calf laid neatly at the steps, its eyes open, its body untouched by any blade or beast. The twins stood behind him in the doorway, their faces half-lit by the moonlight. The silent twin whispered, "It wasn't hungry," before turning away. Elijah's heart sank with a dread he couldn't name. By the next full moon, half the livestock within a mile of their land had vanished or been found the same way, drained, untouched, perfectly still. The townspeople stopped visiting, stopped speaking their name aloud. And though no one dared approach the Ashworth cabin again, they claimed that on certain nights, the woods would echo with a soft humming, two voices intertwined, rising and falling together like a lullaby meant not for the living, but for something restless beneath the earth. The first person to stumble upon the abandoned cabin was a trapper named Samuel Price, a man who knew every inch of the Pike County woods. One late autumn afternoon, while checking his snares near the edge of the Ashworth property, he noticed a faint trail of footprints leading off into a thicket where no path had ever been. The prints were small, almost childlike, and they stopped abruptly in front of an old structure hidden beneath years of overgrowth. The cabin looked ancient, older even than the Ashworth home, its roof sagging, its door hanging from rusted hinges, the smell of damp rot rising from the soil around it. Samuel pushed the door open, and what he found inside froze him where he stood. Every wall, from floor to ceiling, was covered in crude carvings, figures scratched into the wood with desperate repetition. Two children stood side by side in every image, their bodies joined at the chest by a single heart. The carvings varied in size and depth, some barely etched, others gouged so violently that splinters still hung loose, as though carved by trembling hands in a fevered frenzy. The cabin floor was littered with the remnants of small toys, old clothes, and what looked like burnt offerings, melted candles, animal bones, and tiny jars filled with ash. In the center of the room stood a mirror, cracked but still upright, reflecting a distorted version of the carvings that surrounded it. Samuel swore that for a brief moment, he saw movement in that reflection, two shapes, faint but unmistakable, standing just behind him. He spun around, but the room was empty. The air inside the cabin was so heavy it felt alive, pressing against his chest with each breath. He left at once, stumbling back through the trees until the cabin disappeared behind him, swallowed by the woods. When he told the townsfolk what he had seen, they dismissed it at first, thinking it another ghost story meant to frighten children. But Samuel's hands still shook as he spoke, and his face had turned pale as bone. He led a small group back the next morning to prove it. Yet when they reached the spot, the cabin was gone. Only a ring of scorched earth remained, as though it had burned down long ago. The men searched for hours, but not a single trace of the structure could be found. That night, the same men swore they heard faint scratching coming from the trees near their homes, like a knife carving wood. And in the morning, one of them found a small wooden carving left on his doorstep, two children, holding hands, joined by a single heart, freshly marked as though carved the night before. The year the twins turned 16, the tension in the Ashworth household reached a breaking point. The strange bond between them, once merely unsettling, had become unbearable to witness. The livelier twin had grown withdrawn, haunted by dreams he refused to describe, while the other, the one born silent, seemed to grow stronger, more certain, as if he were feeding on something unseen. Elijah noticed it first in their eyes. The cheerful light that once flickered in one had dimmed entirely, replaced by a dull, haunted vacancy, while the other's gaze burned with a cold, knowing clarity. They began to spend hours apart, something they had never done before, and Elijah could feel the air between them thicken with a quiet hostility that he could neither name nor stop. One night, during a heavy mist that rolled down from the mountains, the livelier twin vanished without a sound. The door to the cabin was left open, and the woods beyond seemed darker than usual, as though the fog itself were alive and waiting. Elijah searched for him until dawn, calling his name through the endless rows of black trees, his voice swallowed by the stillness. On the third night, he found the other twin sitting by the riverbank, his clothes soaked, his bare feet buried in the mud. When Elijah demanded to know where his brother had gone, the boy turned slowly and said in a hollow voice, "He found the door." Those were the only words he would speak that night. The search continued for days, but no sign of the missing twin was ever found. Then, on the seventh morning, Elijah discovered him lying at the edge of the woods, shivering and pale, his eyes unfocused, his skin cold as stone. He mumbled incoherently about the other side and a place where the ground breathes. The doctor who examined him found no injuries but warned Elijah that the boy's pulse was faint and irregular, beating almost in rhythm with the wind outside. The silent twin never asked where his brother had been. He only watched him, expressionless, as if he already knew. From that day forward, the bond between them seemed broken, or perhaps changed into something far worse. The once identical boys no longer mirrored one another. The missing twins' reflection no longer appeared in the cabin's remaining mirror, and some nights Elijah swore he saw two shadows where only one sun stood. The silent one often wandered to the woods at dusk, standing still among the trees, whispering softly as though speaking to someone just out of sight, or calling something back that should have stayed gone forever. In the months that followed his brother's return, the surviving twin's condition grew increasingly disturbing. He would wake in the night gasping for breath, his body convulsing as though fighting something unseen, his eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. Elijah, terrified and desperate, sought help from anyone who would listen, but no doctor in Pike County dared approach the family. Word of the Ashworth Twins' curse had spread too far. It wasn't until a physician from Lexington, Dr. Theodore Harlan, arrived on a research expedition that Elijah found someone willing to look. Dr. Harlan was a man of science, skeptical of superstition and fascinated by what he called psychical manifestations. When Elijah described the strange connection between the twins, the shared wounds, the mirrored pain, and the vanishing, Harlan's curiosity overcame his fear. He agreed to take the surviving twin to his laboratory in Lexington for observation, promising that perhaps science could explain what religion and rumor could not. The journey was long and silent. The boy never spoke, not once, though his eyes flickered with something ancient and knowing. In Lexington, Harlan recorded every symptom, every change in the boy's demeanor. At first, he was fascinated by the physiological data, the erratic heartbeats, the shifting temperatures, the way the boy's pupils would dilate simultaneously when shown his own reflection. But fascination soon turned to unease. Late at night, Harlan began to hear two sets of breathing from the cot where only one boy lay. He saw faint impressions in the bedsheets, as though another body shared the space. When he tried to draw blood, the needle filled with air instead of liquid. His instruments malfunctioned constantly, his glass thermometers shattering without cause. The boy rarely moved, yet Harlan often found the furniture shifted slightly each morning, as if the room itself had been disturbed during the night. He began keeping a journal of his observations, though his entries grew increasingly fragmented. He wrote of voices in the walls, of dreams where two children whispered through the dark, asking him to open a door. On the 13th night, the staff heard a scream from his study. When they broke down the door, they found Dr. Harlan dead, his eyes wide open, his face twisted in terror. His notes were burned to ash except for one scrap of paper wedged beneath his hand, scrawled in a trembling script, * they share one soul, but it was never meant to be divided. * The boy was gone. The bed was empty, but faint indentations remained on both sides of the mattress, as though two bodies had risen from it together. Nearly 2 centuries after the Ashworth twins vanished from all record, a team of archaeologists from the University of Kentucky arrived in Pike County to conduct a soil study on land once owned by the Ashworth family. The woods had long reclaimed what was left of the cabin, leaving only a scatter of stones and the faint outline of a foundation. Locals still avoided the place, insisting it was cursed, but the scientists dismissed those old stories as folklore. They began their dig in early October, when the air was cool and the leaves had turned the color of dried blood. Within days, they unearthed fragments of pottery, old nails, and the charred remains of what might have been furniture. But on the 7th day, their instruments began to register something strange, anomalous vibrations beneath the soil, rhythmic, steady, almost like a heartbeat. Intrigued, they dug deeper. About 6 feet down, They struck wood, a coffin, remarkably well preserved despite its age. It bore no markings, no name, only the faint impression of two intertwined circles carved into the lid. The team opened it carefully, expecting two skeletons, but there was only one. A single body lay inside, clothed in decayed remnants of linen, its skull turned slightly to the side as if resting. What startled them most, however, was the space beside the corpse, a perfect impression of another body, the outline still visible in the soil, as though someone or something had once lain there and then vanished. They documented everything meticulously, taking photos, samples, and soil readings. That night, as they prepared to transport the remains, the lead archaeologist swore he heard faint breathing near the open grave. Another team member reported feeling the ground pulse under his boots. They brushed it off as exhaustion until one of their motion sensors recorded two distinct heat signatures standing near the coffin for several minutes before fading abruptly. The next morning, the readings stopped entirely, but a thin layer of condensation had formed inside the coffin, despite the dry air. When the samples were taken back to the university lab, the results were even stranger. The single skeleton exhibited traces of a duplicated genetic structure, two distinct DNA patterns interwoven so tightly that they could not be separated. The phenomenon defied explanation, challenging every known biological law. In the final report, the lead researcher noted that during the final stage of testing, the soil sample began to emit faint rhythmic vibrations once more. They lasted for only a few seconds, then ceased completely, just as the lights in the lab flickered out. When power returned, the coffin lid had shifted slightly open, and though the room was empty, the motion sensors detected two faint, synchronized heartbeats that slowly faded into silence.